Thank you to all the nominees, your families, your willingness to serve our nation. And if I might, Mr. Waltz, or forgive me, Colonel, Congressman Waltz, my thanks to you and to your wife, Julia, who's also served our nation, as you mentioned in introduction, in combat, and to your family. I want to get to the larger questions of the UN and the UN mission, but in your role in the Army, in the House, as National Security Advisor, you have long handled classified and highly sensitive information. We both know Signal is not an appropriate, secure means of communicating highly sensitive information, and yet on March 24th, the Atlantic magazine published a series of Signal messages, including sensitive information about a U.S. military operation against the Houthis in Yemen, involving you and several other Trump officials. Were you investigated for this disclosure of sensitive operational information on Signal?
Thank you, Senator. And that engagement was driven by and recommended by the Cyber Security Infrastructure Security Agency, by the Biden administration, CISA guidance.
I'm sorry.
And I have here, well, just the use of Signal.
Share information on Signal?
The use of, no, excuse me, the use of Signal is not only, as an encrypted app, is not only authorized, it was recommended in Biden's, the Biden era CISA guidance. And in fact, if you just, it says here, I'll read it to you, use only end-to-end encrypted communications, adopt a free messaging application to secure communications that guarantees end-to-end encryption, particularly if you are a highly targeted individual, such as Signal or similar apps. CISA recommends end-to-end encryption messaging on both government and personal devices.
For sensitive military
operational
information?
Of course, Senator. There was no classified information exchanged.
For sensitive military this, you were sharing details about an upcoming airstrike and the time of launch and the potential targets. I mean, this was demonstrably sensitive information. And the question I asked was, were you investigated for this expansion of the Signal group to include a journalist?
The White House conducted an investigation, and my understanding is the Department of Defense is still conducting an investigation.
Was any disciplinary action taken?
From the White House investigation, Senator?
Yes.
No, the use of Signal was not only authorized, it's still authorized and highly recommended.
Would you recommend the use of Signal for classified information to be shared between folks who have access to?
Again, we followed the recommendation, almost the demand, to use end-to-end encryption, but there was no classified information shared.
Did you speak to Secretary Hegseth about his decision to share detailed information on the specifics of an imminent military strike?
What we spoke about, Senator, was a highly successful mission that did something that the Biden administration did not do, was actually target the Houthi leadership. We subsequently saw a ceasefire, an increase in shipping, and a drop in attacks on our ships.
Well, look, here's what I hear on this exchange, and I want to get to the UN point. At the time, you took responsibility for having added a journalist inadvertently to a Signal chat. But it doesn't seem to me that the administration's taken any action to make sure this doesn't happen again. There's been no consequences, and yet the president continues to denounce those who leak information. We both know Signal is not a secure way to convey classified information. And I was hoping to hear from you that you had some sense of regret over sharing what was very sensitive, timely information about a military strike on a commercially available app that's not, as we both know, the appropriate way to share such critical information.
Again, Senator, I think where we have a fundamental disagreement is there was no classified information on that chat.
I'm going to move on for a moment, but we've got plenty more to discuss on that point. China in the UN system, there was plenty of agreement on this side of the dais, and I think with you, that we need to combat anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bias in the UN. We need to ensure taxpayer dollars are well spent. We need to engage in our world. And from your service on the China Task Force, you know very well what a central challenge for us China is. Yet across organizations, the ITU, the FAO, UNESCO, WIPO, I think the only way we successfully push back on China's influence is by being at the table, driving reform. When President Trump withdrew from the World Health Organization, the Chinese sent their largest delegation ever to the next meeting. They've contributed $500 million. They're now the biggest contributor. I can understand some of the frustrations or concerns that led to the withdrawal from UNESCO, but in the last Congress, with Israeli support, I led our rejoining UNESCO. We've talked about, you've mentioned earlier today, standard-setting bodies as being essential. How do you balance a budget request that dramatically reduces our contributions to the UN with needing to be at the table to fight for the standards, whether it's telecommunications, civil aviation, intellectual property? You just waved, here's this great big list of organizations. Many of them do critical things. How are you going to strike that balance appropriately, sir?
Thank you, Senator, and it was good to discuss this with you. I will point out in the President's budget request there is funding for IAEA, for the International Civil Aviation Organization, for the Organization Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, for the ITU, for the IMO and maritime, and so I look forward to working with you and working with this committee on how we make those decisions of where we engage and then how we engage. But I think we're in violent agreement that we have to block and tackle Chinese influence.
Would you pledge to not support just unilateral withdrawal from these organizations?
I will certainly support and follow the Secretary and the President's guidance as we weigh that engagement through these reviews.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Waltz, do you believe President Trump has the constitutional power to determine troop assignments?
Thank you, Senator. And his Article 2 authority, I do.
In the summer of 2020, there was much discussion and there have been statements by President Trump that he intended to draw down troops in Afghanistan. You were serving on the Armed Services Committee at that time, and Liz Cheney and Jason Crow put forward an amendment. And with that amendment, they attempted to circumscribe his power to assign troops. They specifically added conditions, and you supported that amendment. So I guess my question is, which is it? Does President Trump have the power under the Constitution to determine troops, or do you think Congress should, as you attempted to do when you voted for Liz Cheney's amendment, do you think Congress has the right to limit his power to remove troops from a war situation?
I certainly, thank you, Senator. I certainly supported President Trump's effort to draw down our forces, to keep Bagram Air Base, to keep a lid on counterterrorism, and certainly keep a powerful presence there.
You voted for the Jason Crow amendment, the Liz Cheney amendment, to place restrictions on his ability to remove troops. Specifically, the amendment said he couldn't draw them down under 8,500 troops.
Senator, I'll have to go back and look at the specific details of that amendment, or whether that was a broader vote.
Pretty important amendment
for the
because
NDAA.
it goes to the heart of the Constitution, and this is sort of the problem and one of the things I fear. The Liz Cheney wing of the party, the neoconservatives, they believe in virtually unlimited Article 2 authority when going to war, to initiate war. There seems to be no limits. The idea that Congress should be involved with declaring war is sort of passé, it's old-fashioned. But when it comes to ending a war, you voted with Liz Cheney and the others to say that the president couldn't end the war, that he had to perform different reports. Here's what one of the reports said that he had to do before he was allowed to remove troops. This is the Cheney-Crow Amendment. It required a report from President Trump concerning the status of women's access to voting, education, justice, and economic opportunities. You know, support for women's rights is great, but it's really not typically given as a reason to go to war or stay at war. And basically the amendment you voted for based the decision on whether or not he would have to explain himself as to how well it was going for women in Afghanistan before Congress would consent. Specifically, the amendment says you wouldn't fund or allow him to move troops with DOD funds. It was an incredible amendment. I've never seen anything like this, where Congress actually voted to remove DOD funds to let the president remove troops from a war theater. Look, I'm a big fan of the limitation of presidential power on initiating war, but once we're at war, I've never really quibbled with the president's power to execute the war, to be the commander-in-chief. When you were deployed, I can't see Congress coming to Congress and saying, well, how are women's rights over there for Colonel Waltz? Should he be able to go in there or leave because, well, let's have a congressional report on this? I mean, I think that's insane, and I just don't understand how you could have voted for this. I mean, should Congress force President Trump to analyze such vague terms as justice before removing troops from a war zone? I mean, I don't understand how you could have voted for this amendment.
Senator, I look forward to continuing our discussion that we had. There's a lot of room in between where we have troops and necessarily if we're at war. So, for example, we've had troops in Colombia for quite some time. They're not actively engaged in combat. They're engaged in a training mission to help that government through our presence on the ground.
Afghanistan was
and
one of the
so
rare
I think
times.
One of the things at the time
Afghanistan
the president
was one of the
looking
rare
to do
times
was
when Congress actually had authorized. We voted for an authorization of force. It's one of the few times I can think of in recent history I would have actually supported that resolution. Congress voted to send the troops to Afghanistan to get the people who attacked us on 9/11. And yet you were willing to, in a war zone where soldiers were at war, place restrictions on the president's ability to move troops around based on women's access to voting. There's also another clause in there that said based on how well the Afghans were dealing with disabilities. Look, I have a great deal for people with disabilities. That's a big issue in our country, but it really isn't an issue of war. And to hamstring and tie President Trump's hands and say, oh, well, you can't remove, troops until we discuss how well the Afghan government is dealing with disabilities. Are they going to be able to deal with disabilities when we go? I guess it just worries me that you come more from the Liz Cheney wing of the party than the Donald Trump wing of the party.
Senator, I am squarely with the president, have been with him in every single election I participated in and him with me in terms of the limits on hard power. And I can tell you for certain that people who hate war the most are the people that have to go fight them and die from them. I have many of them with me, and I never want to attend another funeral, and I certainly support the president's diplomacy first, as I know you do, approach, as we just saw in the Middle East, his commercial diplomacy that we're seeing around the world, and will do everything I can, if confirmed as ambassador of the United Nations, to keep us out of wars and to end conflicts.
Senator Booker.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate it. But before I begin my questions, I just want to raise my deep concerns with the mass reductions in force that took place in the State Department on Friday. I find it particularly troubling that many of those who were let go worked on issues related to women, to human rights, and counterterrorism. And I do look forward to discussing this more in depth on this committee going forward. So, Congressman, I'm going to start with you because this morning it was reported, despite being removed from your role as National Security Advisor in May, removed from your role, right, not working, surprisingly, you've been on the White House payroll for the last few months. So throughout this hearing, you've made assertions that if confirmed, you would root out waste and unnecessary overhead at the UN. So can you confirm for us whether you've been receiving a salary from the White House since being let go at the NSA?
Thank you, Senator. I was not fired. The president never said that, nor did the vice president. I was kept on as an advisor, transitioning a number of important activities, and now hope to be confirmed with the Senate's consent
that you were not
to be
dismissed from your role, as was publicly reported, because it's also been publicly reported that you've been receiving almost $200,000 of the taxpayer money since you were dismissed from being the National Security Advisor.
Well, the reporting, Senator, is fake news, which shouldn't surprise anyone. The president was clear. His announcement was, I will nominate
fake news
Mr.
can't
Waltz,
be the
and
answer
then the
to
vice president
everything.
was quite clear.
So we're going to move on to UNESCO because we got a lot to talk about there. Undoubtedly, UNESCO has its flaws, including the history of anti-Israel bias. But the U.S. has also played a key role in defending Israel at the UN agency. So the U.S. has called for votes against unbalanced resolutions and supported efforts that promote international Holocaust education, press freedom, literacy programs, scientific innovation, and protect and restore cultural heritage sites. Since rejoining UNESCO in 2023, the U.S. has also successfully included references to Hamas's October 7th terrorist attack and the plight of the hostages in UNESCO documents. However, during periods of U.S. withdrawal from UNESCO, China has stepped up its own engagement, becoming UNESCO's largest financial contributor and using this platform to push its own priorities. We know they are contrary to ours. So, Congressman, how might maintaining our presence at UNESCO support its work on U.S. priorities like Holocaust education, press freedom, all of the other things that I just mentioned, while ensuring that the PRC does not continue to expand its influence within the body? And how can our membership in UNESCO continue to provide us that platform for countering any future anti-Israel actions and, I would say, terrorism overall?
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you, Senator. And I certainly support, as I mentioned to the ranking member, any initiative to block and tackle Chinese Communist Party influence throughout any of these organizations. However, I do think we have to review closely our membership in these organizations, if we're getting return for the taxpayer dollars, if they're in line with our interests.
Would you recommend?
As you know, in the first term, we withdrew from UNESCO. Under President Reagan, we renewed from UNESCO, and often it's been incredibly unhelpful to both Israel and the United States on the world stage.
Recommend to Secretary Rubio we withdraw from UNESCO?
If confirmed, I'll engage with Secretary Rubio and participate in that review, but as you know, it's currently under review.
Thank you. Let's see, because yes. So I'm sorry, withdrawing from UNESCO, I want to go back to that because Order 14199 mandates a review of the United States participation in UNESCO and explicitly requires a U.S. ambassador to the UN consult with the Secretary of State. So we'll look forward to that report from you on that. I do some questions about women in Ukraine, but I know that Senator Barrasso's here, so that's fine. You were kind enough to leave it open.
Appreciate that. We've had a good hearing. Thank you to our witnesses for being here.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Senator, and congratulations to all of you on your nominations. Congressman Waltz, I want to start with some questions related to your tenure at the National Security Council that will also relate to your responsibilities at the United Nations, especially in the area of international humanitarian relief, because you presided over a period where Elon Musk was given a blank check to take what he called a chainsaw to AID, and as part of that, undermined many ongoing humanitarian operations, including the one in Sudan, where the freezing of U.S. humanitarian assistance resulted in the closure of nearly 80% of emergency food kitchens. 2 million people were left without access to food. Many of them died, and that's not theoretical either. I want to turn to another humanitarian disaster, and that's in Gaza. And of course, the horrendous situation in Gaza was brought about as a result of the horrific Hamas attacks of October 7, 2023. It's also true that the government of Israel has a responsibility to conduct that war in accordance with international law and humanitarian principles. For 78 days, the Netanyahu government imposed a total humanitarian blockade on Gaza, including blockade on food. I didn't hear you or President Trump or Secretary Rubio ever call upon the Netanyahu government publicly to end that blockade. The Netanyahu government then replaced the system of distribution of food through vetted international organizations, including, for example, the World Food Program that Cindy McCain heads. They replaced it with a private entity, which is supported by mercenaries, known as the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, a real misnomer. The organization's original executive director resigned, saying that it was not possible to implement their plan while adhering to humanitarian principles. Cindy McCain said they don't have nearly enough access points and they don't have nearly enough food going in. As you probably know, it's been called a death trap. Hundreds of Palestinian civilians crowding to get food have been killed, either by the security contractors, mercenaries, or by the IDF. So my question to you is, why should American taxpayers be footing the bill even part of the bill, in support of the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation?
Thank you for the question, Senator. And just to address your first question in terms of USAID and its current status, it is currently operating under the State Department. It's been merged, which you may disagree with, but I think is a perfectly valid approach.
I'm sorry.
I'll just point out that both the United Kingdom and Australians have done the same thing. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to a foreign service officer or an ambassador out in the field, highly frustrated that aid was on a different page than their objectives in the country. And so I certainly support
we have
Secretary's
We
reorganization.
have a strong disagreement. If you could answer my question about American taxpayer dollars going to fund this private entity with
I would certainly extend an appreciation in my heart out for a couple of veterans who were just attacked by Hamas with grenades as trying to distribute aid that I understand, according to reporting, works for this organization. I don't think this should be a zero sum. I do agree that is a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. I hope you would agree that Hamas could stop it tomorrow by laying down their arms and releasing the hostages.
I agree,
and we
so let's
support
settle on that.
Special Envoy Witkoff and his efforts to again bring a ceasefire,
look,
which he was able to bring.
Look, you all said you were going to end the war in Gaza on day one. It's a long way from.
Well,
I have one
the
other
president
question.
said all hell to pay.
Let me just
the
let me
first
ask
time
you a
that we
question.
actually got a
Congressman,
ceasefire.
I want to ask you a question on the West Bank. You saw that an American citizen was killed the other day by violent settlers. Do you see that report?
I actually, Senator, to be honest with you, I did not see that report.
All right. Do you agree that it's the responsibility of the United States government to ensure the accountability in the deaths of American citizens overseas?
Senator, I would say it's a key function of any embassy or ambassador to ensure U.S. citizens are protected abroad.
Okay. Well, I hope we will pursue that. You know, one of your first actions, along with the president, was to get rid of the Biden-era executive order that would impose sanctions on both violent settlers and violent Palestinian militants in the West Bank. And we've now had 5 Americans actually killed since October 7th in the West Bank, and no accountability. I think when you withdrew that executive order, you sent a very bad signal. I hope we can work together to make sure that we protect all American citizens overseas.
Senator Paul.
Senator Daines.
Mr. Waltz, thank you for being here today, and thank you for your very distinguished service to our great nation and Special Forces. I very much enjoyed our conversation yesterday, and thank you for accepting going through this process to play a very important role here at the United Nations. Mr. Waltz, as you know, the United Nations has become a hotbed of anti-Semitism, a hotbed of anti-Israeli sentiment. UN employees participated in the October 7th attacks, and Israeli hostages were held at UN facilities for months. The UN recently reappointed Francesca Albanese despite her repeatedly stated support for Palestinian resistance and regurgitation of anti-Israel blood libel. My question, Mr. Waltz, is you clearly have your work cut out for you at the UN. Can you tell us more about how you plan to counter the anti-Semitic influence of UN officials like Ms. Albanese?
Well, thank you, Senator, and I always enjoy our engagement as well and your advocacy for the America First agenda. I mean, just to add a couple points to your list and then to answer your question, you know, it's notable that the military leader of Hamas, Mohammed Sinwar, had an UNRWA badge on him in the tunnels of Gaza. There's indications that the World Health Organization and its hospitals, they knew that tunnels were being built underneath and knew that these hospitals were being used. And I have some of our veterans with you, have literally been shot at by terrorists hiding behind women and hiding behind children, and for Hamas to literally line the walls of its hideouts with hostages to protect its leadership is atrocious, and it should be called out at every turn. Yet, we just had to veto a resolution in the Security Council that went after Israel in what is absolutely a horrific war, and didn't even mention Hamas. And certainly didn't mention the fact that its leaders deliberately sacrifice, as a matter of strategy and tactics, deliberately sacrifice their own people in order to turn world opinion against Israel. So I think probably the easiest way to answer your question is sunlight is often the best disinfectant, and to continue to spotlight it and use not only the platform that is this position, but I think one of the best communicators in the world, which is President Trump, Secretary Rubio, and the leadership in this administration to continue to call it out.
Mr. Waltz, thank you, and I'm grateful that you have moral clarity on this important issue. And certainly, as somebody who, like yourself, you have served in special operations. These are not theoretical exercises for you. You've seen the conflict between good and between evil. We talked a bit about Central Asia yesterday, Mr. Waltz. It's a vitally important region, rich in natural resources. As you mentioned, you've spent some time over there in your prior career. Much of those resources are untapped, and the region could be a valuable new partner for energy exports to Europe. The UN, unfortunately, has pushed Central Asian countries to only adopt really a radical green agenda instead of more a balanced approach of all the above energy. And these radical green development goals could hinder the growth and success of developing countries like we see in Central Asia. Mr. Waltz, how can you, as UN ambassador, ensure that Central Asia is encouraged to take advantage of its vast and considerable energy resources to foster a more sustainable and a prosperous future?
Yeah, thank you, and I appreciated the conversation and always learn a lot from them. One of the things that I admire about how President Trump approaches diplomacy, we saw it in his first Middle East trip, is what I call commercial diplomacy. The thing that binds people together often is business. It transcends dogma. It transcends ancient ideologies. You're seeing that in the Abraham Accords. When people are talking about data centers and rail and roads, they're not talking about thousand-year-old hatreds. In Central Asia in particular, I mean, going back to the old TAPI pipeline, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, one could only imagine if that had been in place. And now everyone has a common economic interest rather than fighting each other. I think we have real opportunities with Turkmenistan for the first time in a long time for their gas to head westward rather than eastward. We talked about the C5 grouping. We talk about Azerbaijan and their desire to not only come closer to the United States, but to perhaps put a real agreement in place with the Armenians, a real agreement in place with the Israelis, the commercial opportunities that abound for not only for American business, but that will change the geopolitical landscape. And I look forward to working with you and those groupings within the UN along those lines under the President Secretary's leadership.
Mr. Waltz, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Waltz, thanks so much for coming to my office yesterday, and I enjoyed the discussion. I know you're going to do a terrific job representing our nation's interests at the United Nations. We are the largest financial contributor to the U.S. We've contributed, $13 billion to the United Nations the last fiscal year. As the U.S. ambassador to the UN, you're going to need to closely examine how American taxpayer funding is being used by so many of these international programs. Can you talk about your commitment to reviewing every dollar going to the UN to ensure that our taxpayer dollars is being used wisely? And I mean, if I recall, you had a list yesterday of just some amazing places that I think taxpayers would be really offended to see that their taxpayer dollars were going to through the United Nations. Could you share some of that information with us?
Thank you, Senator, and I always appreciate our time together. One of the kind of the main thrusts of the UN, particularly over the last, I'd say, a couple of decades, has been on climate and focus on climate change and a number of initiatives. And setting aside the debate on on climate. If you just look at the organizations, amongst the 80 various specialized agencies, core programs, and funds, you have the UN Environment Program, the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environmental Program, the Global Environment Facility, the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, the Montreal Protocol, and then you have other agencies like the Global Fund for HIV, Tuberculosis, and Malaria. Okay, but it has as its core mission, one of its core missions, not necessarily those things, but climate change is the largest global health challenge in the 21st century. And just to further, I mean, I have a page here, Mr. Chairman, or I have a list of pages, 455 of international organizations that we contribute some type of funding towards, and just
Let's put those in the record.
a few of them. The Pacific Salmon Commission, the Pacific Islands Forum Fishery Agency, the Pan-African Postal Union, the Pan-American Health Organization, the Pan-American Institute on Geography and History, the International Lithosphere Program. I mean, so these are the, again, this is, it's quite a list. And this is tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands to 7 to 8 figures to millions that are going to these organizations. And I think it is incumbent on this administration to say, what's it doing? Is it making us safer, stronger, and more prosperous? And are we getting a bang for our buck?
A couple other questions, because the thing I hear about at home in Wyoming is American sovereignty and what the United Nations is trying to do and undermining us. How are you going to work to preserve and to protect American sovereignty within the UN?
Thank you, Senator. And I have to say, America's sovereignty will always be first and foremost as we engage all of these international organizations. I think we need to weigh the pros and cons of which organizations we engage, and I think that will be a robust discussion with this committee and with the administration. But to the extent that we do, our sovereignty, our people, our bosses will be first and foremost and top of mind.
I think this came up in both the introduction, a good introduction by Senator Lee, as well as Senator Scott, and in your opening remarks. The fact that the Palestinian Authority has repeatedly sought to use the United Nations as a platform to declare statehood and to downgrade the status of Israel. Will you commit to using the American veto to block these one-sided anti-Israel resolutions at the UN Security Council?
Thank you, Senator. Of course, I will work closely with the President and the Secretary on those votes, but yes, I'll make that commitment.
Do you have any specific measures that you believe should be taken to address the bias against Israel within the UN, and how do we advocate for those changes?
Well, first and foremost has to be UNRWA. It simply not only needs to be defunded, which the President has put in place with his executive order, but it should be dismantled, and we can have a conversation on who and what can take up those humanitarian roles, but it certainly should not be UNRWA.
And then in terms of the selecting a new Secretary General after this term expires, is that something I imagine you'd be very much involved in and perhaps could use some of those same plans in terms of what we need to do there?
So the Secretary General's term will expire at the end of next year. My understanding is kind of the race, so to speak, and the campaigning for that will start this fall, and I'll certainly commit to work with you and others to make sure that we have someone in line with our interests.
So, Mr. Chairman, I'd suggest that make sure we have somebody representing the United States at the UN with this nominee by that time, and that all those activities begin.
Good suggestion.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Ricketts, and congratulations to the nominees, and I especially want to shout out a VMI grad, Congressman Waltz. I want to follow up on Senator Coons' questions on the use of Signal, just to make sure we're all on the same wavelength here. Signal is useful because it's encrypted, and a whole lot of people use Signal, and there's nothing wrong for it. But as far as I know, Signal has not been approved for use by U.S. government officials for the sharing of classified information. Is that correct?
That is correct, Senator.
Right. And you indicated...
Thank you for the shout out on VMI, Robert J. Bell.
Great institution. You indicated in your testimony that no classified information was shared, and I I see nothing in the reporting about your situation to suggest that you shared classified information. I do see the question of, why did your office add the Atlantic reporter? That was an amateurish move, and I'm sure you've learned something from that. But on the question of whether classified information was shared, there are at least 2 DOD investigations. One, the DOD IG, and the second, Air Force, an investigation ongoing into whether Secretary Hegseth shared classified information. My understanding is those are ongoing. They haven't yet reached a conclusion, but they certainly haven't reached the conclusion that no classified information is shared. Am I wrong about that?
Senator, thank you for the question. I shouldn't and can't comment on ongoing investigations. What I can do is echo Secretary Hegseth's testimony that no names, targets, locations, units, routes, sources, methods, no classified information from his perspective was shared.
I got it. I'm sure Secretary Hegseth says he didn't share any classified information, but the fact of the matter is there are 2 investigations going on at the Pentagon precisely to determine in an objective and independent way whether classified information was shared. At a minimum, sharing attack plans with sensitive military information that shouldn't have been shared. There was an article that I just read that came out late yesterday that I would like to introduce in the record, Mr. Chair. It's the Trump administration is about to incinerate 500 tons of emergency food. It was published in the Atlantic yesterday. I'd like to introduce it in the record.
Without objection.
This really is a little bit more of a setup for the hearing we're going to have tomorrow with Michael Regas, but I just wanted to put it on the record so that he could be prepared to answer this question. The article suggests that 500 tons of food purchased by the United States to the tune of about $800,000 months ago that are nutritional biscuits designed to stop children from starving have been in a warehouse in Dubai for months and months and months. Senator Rubio has testified about that both here and in the House, that he would make sure that food purchased to keep kids from starving would not be allowed to spoil. The article suggests that this food is on the verge of spoliation and that the U.S. has not distributed it, but is instead planning to incinerate it. Now, I know Mr. Arrigo and Ms. Treddy have had nothing to do with this, and I assume, Representative Waltz, that this is not an issue that you've been involved in up to this point.
Senator, it hasn't.
Okay. Then let me ask a question that just is a values question, a kind of level set. And I'll start with Mr. Arrigo, and I would just like to go across. I'm going to make a statement, and I want to ask if you agree with me or not. If the United States has purchased specialty foods designed to help kids from starving, we should deliver that food to kids rather than allow it to spoil and incinerate it. That's my view. Do you agree with me or not, Mr. Arrigo?
Well, thank you very much for the question. Senator, as a private citizen, this is something I've just heard of today, and I haven't been briefed on this situation. I really don't know exactly the depth of what you're saying. So I would actually have to probably refer back to the Secretary Rubio, President Trump, and find out exactly where and what happened to this particular situation so I could answer you better. I'd hate to say something.
Representative Waltz.
Thank you.
Senator, we should always be good stewards of the taxpayer dollars. And if it's been purchased, then I don't disagree it should be delivered. However, if you look at situations, and I think there's just more to dig into there, and I'm unaware, it's the first time hearing of it, but if you, for example,
I do want to let Ms.
well, in Sudan, they have real distribution problems. In Gaza, there's real distribution problems. So there could be
a lot of starving kids in Sudan.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Ms. Treddy, how about you? What do you think?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I agree with you. That does not mean that I'm judging what has happened.
I'm glad that you answered unequivocally. This is such a simple question. It's such a simple question. If the U.S. has purchased food and it's to be used for the eradication of starvation among children, we should give it to children and not incinerate it. I mean, it is such a simple question. I just asked you to test your values, and I'll just go back to you, Representative Waltz, as I close. In your testimony, you asked, is our money being well spent when you talked about the United Nations? The need to be great stewards. Allowing this food to sit in a warehouse and then burn it rather than let kids eat it and survive I know what my constituents would think about that, and I think I know what all of our constituents would think about that. I yield back.
Congressman Waltz, I've watched this hearing, and I've been really disappointed. And what's been troubling to me about your nomination from the beginning is your failure to just stand up and take accountability for mistakes that you made and that all Americans know that you've made. Everyone in this room, every one of us has made mistakes, but what America expects from leaders, especially leaders who are tasked with our national security or could be tasked with the position for which you're nominated for, is for people to stand up and just take responsibility, take accountability. But I heard you just blame Biden. I've seen you not only fail to stand up, but lie. You said about this person when you were involved in the sharing of sensitive information about imminent military operations. I've listened to you now for weeks and months. You said this journalist intentionally infiltrated that signal chain. You said that he was sucked in. You denied, deflected, and then you did something that to me really lacks integrity, is that you sought out to demean and degrade that very journalist in crass and frankly cruel ways that made him a target. That's not leadership. When you blame people that tell the truth, that's not leadership. When you can't say the words, I made a mistake, I could have done better, I learned valuable lessons from this experience. Instead, at a moment where our national security was clearly compromised, you denied, you deflected, and then you demeaned and degraded those people who objectively told the truth and criticized your actions. Smearing people, attacking folks, singling them out just furthers, it compounds what I think is disqualifying about you for this position. It also, to me, just shows profound cowardice. You should step up right now. I heard Senator Coons. I heard you being asked by Senator Kaine again and again to simply say, I was wrong. I made a mistake. I take responsibility for my actions. Unfortunately, what you're doing to me is perfectly in line with the way this administration as a whole has operated. I've never seen an administration that has made no mistakes, can't learn constructively from things they did wrong, has no sense of self-interrogation or integrity. And should they be criticized legitimately, they go on the attack. We have too much of that rhetoric, that divisive, demeaning, degrading, cruelness that's being elevated and celebrated by this administration that you seem to fall in line with. I just watched with great disappointment that even after weeks, if not months of reflection, you couldn't sit before this committee and take some responsibility and talk constructively about what's learned. Instead, you do what seems to be yet another creative tool that people are doing, which is, hey, let me just blame Biden. I want to take another moment to discuss concerns I have with this administration's approach to the United Nations and its dealings with African countries. Every country in the UN gets one vote in the General Assembly, no matter how large or small it is. So diplomacy and staffing at our State Department and their embassies really matter, but this administration has fired over 1,350 staff at the State Department, including whole offices that spearheaded multilateral affairs. Sub-Saharan Africa has alone, the member states have 49 votes. I've watched how China has done everything they can to court support at the United Nations and how we wonder why are so many countries voting against us. And I truly believe, and I've said this to the Secretary of State, that we need to start prioritizing African nations, start focusing on what I believe is urgently within our national interests, if not our national security interests. It seems to me that we are ceding and surrendering Sub-Saharan Africa to China, who is stepping up more and more and filling in the void of our leadership. So I have no questions for you, sir. I have nothing but deep disappointment in what I consider a failure of leadership on your part. God, America needs now more than ever, forget the partisanship, just people to step up and show heart and integrity and honor. When you lie, defer, deflect, demean, and degrade journalists, to me, it's absolutely unacceptable. I have no questions. I cannot support your nomination. I think you've shown a failure of leadership at a time that America especially needs people of honor to stand up and show what leadership actually is.
Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, excuse me. Mr. Waltz, these last few months have illustrated how China is all too eager to take advantage of our disengagement at the UN and around the world. And while we may not all like what some UN institutions do, if we aren't at the table, we can't influence the agenda. So do you agree that if confirmed, a central responsibility of your role at the UN will be to ensure that the United States is present, able, and willing to counter the PRC's growing influence at the UN?
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. I appreciate the question. I agree it's absolutely critical. And if confirmed, yes, I agree. I will take just a second to point out, under the first Trump administration, under the 2018 National Security Strategy, he really led the pivot, which I think pivoted the entire national security apparatus in Washington, D.C., away from the Middle East, away from counterterrorism, not as a zero sum, but to focus on the near-peer threat that China absolutely is. And then just in this administration, Secretary Rubio's first trip was down to Panama to address what we've all heard, hearing after hearing, encroachment on the Panama Canal, a strategic waterway. Panama is now the first Latin American country in decades to back away from the Belt and Road Initiative. The malicious behavior, but also the potential of the Chinese Communist Party, the malicious behavior, the potential of the relationship, I should say, will be top of mind for me. I know it is for the Secretary and the President.
I agree with you, Congressman. That's why I find it so puzzling that there's been no coherent strategy for how to address China within this administration. There's no consistent messaging. If you look at where China is moving in, where the United States has moved out, within days of our shutting down of USAID and foreign assistance programs, China was already labeling the United States as an unreliable partner. Within months, China has moved in to so many of those foreign assistance programs that have been shut down, that had been operating for years to provide a role for the United States in so much of the world. And we have packed up our bags and gone home, and China's there. They're on the ground. And if you read the report, you will see instance after instance that questions why what we're doing makes us stronger against China and allows us to compete. So let me ask another question about the UN, because this administration has outlined a host of cuts to UN and its sub-agencies. It makes no secret of its disdain for multilateral institutions, but I haven't seen a plan from the administration on how it intends to push back against the PRC's influence. So can you describe how you think we should be doing that?
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. And just a few points to address there. Number one, I look forward to reading the report and to working with you, the committee, and the team on that. I have to tell you, though, in my experience, even in the last 6 months, but even more broadly, I've seen partners in the Middle East that were heading into the PRC's orbit make it very clear that they want to work with the United States, particularly since the election of President Trump. I think the peace agreement between the DRC and Rwanda that we just saw in the Oval Office, China has had all kinds of activities across Africa, but they've also heavily polluted, bring in their own labor, often engage in certain types of corruption. Is we have a race for national resources to power the economies of the future. I think that was an incredible moment. And from the president's perspective, I feel confident in saying that he sees the power of our markets, he sees the power of our economy, he sees AI and energy and other things that we need to unleash in the future. First and foremost, of course, we have to have a strong and capable military, but truly where he's seeking to win this competition, and we will win it, is through those economic endeavors. And I also say, to answer your question more directly with the UN, we've actually seen leadership of major agencies by the PRC go down. This was an initiative started in the first Trump administration. There's an office now in the State Department international organizations. It's very focused on these races. They've gone from 4 to 1. But I take your point. They're also pushing their folks at the mid and lower levels, and we need to compete in that space.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Can I just, I'm a little over time, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on what the UN's role in Syria should be as we're looking at, I think the Trump administration has taken important steps to removing barriers around the sanctions that have been a problem for Syria moving forward. So what should the UN's role be there?
Thank you, Senator. It's something that Secretary Rubio in particular, but the entire administration has looked very closely at. I mean, since we had the fall of the Assad regime during the transition, I actually think it was a bit of a good news bipartisan story on how everyone worked together to make what has been a bold step in the president lifting sanctions. So to answer your question directly, first and foremost, if confirmed, is to work with our allies and partners. We have literally years and layers of sanctions that were intended for the Assad regime, counter-Iranian influence, and as the Saudis, the Emiratis, our Gulf Arab allies, the Turks in particular, under now the leadership of Ambassador Tom Barrack, I think there's tremendous opportunity there, but we have a moment. It almost reminds me of kind of the post-Libya phase, where we have a moment that we can seize, or if Syria devolves into chaos, I think it could pull the region with it. But right now, it's a moment of opportunity, and I hope to complement both Special Envoy Witkoff, Secretary Rubio, Ambassador Barrack, and others with our efforts up in the UN.
Well, hopefully we'll do better in Syria than we did in Libya. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Amen to that. Senator Sheen, thank you for that. And Senator Waltz, thank you for your focus on